Hey guys and gals, in this video we're going to be talking about my open source JavaScript project, sc2bovo.com. So you can follow that to find the live version of the project, or you can go to my GitHub to see the current version of the code. Both links will be in the description. Now before we get started, I want to say I'm not going to be talking about the what or the why of Bovo, because we've already made a video on that in the past, but today we're going to be talking about the nuts and bolts behind how this application works. So to start off, let's look at our repository structure. So here you can see we have a bunch of HTML files, and if we look at these, they're just static HTML pages. None of them have any logic behind them except for this Bovo page, and this is where the actual web application is hosted. So to see the logic behind that, let's go to this JS folder, or our JavaScript folder, and this is where all the logic will be contained. So let's start with this main.js. So this file is primarily responsible for adding rows and actions to the build order display. So the build order display is this top section where we keep each little step of our build order. This bottom section here, where I'm actually clicking the actions and changing these images, this is the Action Selector. So we select actions from the Action Selector and they appear in the build order display. So when we add an action, all it does is it goes through and it creates a new HTML element that copies the image that I selected in this grid below, and it puts that new element in whatever highlighted row we have here. And this highlighted row is dictated by the CSS class active, and I'll talk about that in just a second. Before we get to that, let's talk about delete action. And this is pretty simple. All it does is it deletes an action within our build order display. So when I click an action, it deletes itself, and all images to the right will get left aligned, keeping everything nice and neat. Next, we have add BO unit. And what this does is it creates the HTML for a row in our build order display by calling the function create BO unit. Once it creates that unit, it will append it wherever it needs to go, and that will be at the very end of the list. So every time I hit add a step, we make a new row and it's active. Now the reason I made create BO unit, which actually makes all the HTML that goes into this row, the reason this is separate is for insert below BO unit. When we hit add a step, it's always at the end of our build order, but we can hit insert and add a step in the middle of it if needed. So we made create BO unit a standalone function so we can make a new row and then have functions add BO unit or insert below BO unit to properly place that HTML wherever the user needs it to go. So moving on to set active BO unit, and what this does is every time I click a row, it's going to make that the active row. And using that CSS class active earlier, or that I mentioned earlier, that's the class we use to make this happen. So when I click a row, it removes the active CSS class from everything and then re-adds it to whatever row I clicked on. Lastly, we have delete BO unit, which instead of just deleting a single image, we can delete the whole row entirely. So pretty simple there. Okay, so now let's hop back to exportbo.js. And this file is named a little bit weird because in the minimal viable product of Bovo, there's no actual exporting tools. And the way it works is we can hit stop editing, and then we can allow our users to screenshot their build, but there's no formal exporting functionality at the moment. So this exportbo.js, all it does is it hides the editing tools. That way we can get a cleaner screenshot with more information on it for our users. So here we have stop editing and start editing. And all this really does is it'll hide the action selector, it'll hide the delete and insert below, and then it'll make the notes column take up the extra space. So not a whole lot of functionality there at the moment, but if the product continues to progress after this, then this will be where all the export to PDF or PNG logic will go. Lastly, we have set action selector, and what this does is it handles setting the images we see in this action grid within the action selector. So the images that appear in this grid depend on two things. One, what faction or race do you have selected? And then two, do you have structures, units, upgrades, or miscellaneous clicked after that? So for an example, I can click this first race, Terran, and click units, and I'll see Terran units. Likewise, if I click Zerg and then units, I see Zerg units, not Terran units. So this JavaScript file is responsible for handling that logic. So every time we select a race, we want to style that race, and you can see whichever one I click on is a lighter blue than the other two. After that, we need to set the action category. So when you select a race, by default, it's going to show you the structures for that race. So now when we look at it, we can see right to grid. And what this does is it takes a list of images and then it will populate the grid with that list. So what's happening is here we have Zerg structures, and behind the scenes, we have a list that says hatchery.png, extractor.png, spawningpool.png, and it's just a list of images that goes on and on for every structure that Zerg has. And then all we do is we say, okay, this top leftmost cell is 0, 0, to the right is 0, 1, to the right of that is 0, 2, the next row would be 1, 0, 1, 1, 1, 2, and so on and so on. So all we're doing is we're taking a list of images and we're writing it to this grid that we defined in HTML. Next, we have set action category. So here we have all the image files in a list according to whatever race and action type is selected. So here we can see if they select Terran structures, then we have a list of supply depot, command center, refinery. And if I go Terran structures, I see supply depot, command center, refinery. Likewise, we can go down and I can look at Protoss. So if they select Protoss and structures, we'll see Nexus Assimilator Pylon, Protoss structures, Nexus Assimilator Pylon. So all we're doing here is creating that list of images depending on what's selected, and then we call that write to grid function. We call that function so we write the list to the HTML grid, and that gives us all the functionality we need for this tool. So thanks for watching. This was a brief overview of sc2bovo.com.